Why, hello, and welcome to another adventure in our book club. And, well, this week we have a very, very short piece about some very angry books. We are talking, of course, about Jonathan Swift's The Battle of the Books. But before we get to the Battle of the Books, remember there is our shop where we have very interesting things, lots of books. There are new books coming this year. And also writing services, things to help you with your writing. Over on our Redbubble shop, we have loads and loads of designs. There's over 100 designs on there now. So go over there, check it out. It really helps support us. Also, if you want to support the channel, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share the video. That always helps, and it doesn't cost you anything. So, that out of the way, we are now going to battle some books. So the Battle of the Books is one of the early works by Swift. I'm going to put this down because I don't need to hold this the whole time. The Battle of the Books is one of the early works by Swift, and it actually comes from from something that was happening in the literary world at the time. So this is a work of a young man. It's very playful. But in the literary world, at the time he was writing, at the turn of the 18th century, so 17th, 18th century, there was an argument within scholarship over how text was actually approached. This is not something that is actually that unusual to us today. We'll get into that later. But there was a split between what was the value of writing and historical text and older texts. And for instance, so the ancients, what are called the ancients, the people who were on the side of the ancients, believed that a text should be edifying, should be moralizing, should really, you should be able to learn lessons, and it should develop one's character. So this is the idea that a text should have a moral imperative. Now, this is something you actually see in those two prefaces of Shakespeare by Pope and Johnson, both of whom have an issue with Shakespeare not being a particularly moral, having any great moral lessons. Not what Shakespeare was after, but it is a concern of people of this period and people earlier that a text should be edifying. You see this very much in the works of Richardson. Pamela and Clarissa are very much supposed to be moralizing, edifying works. So taking an ancient concept of what a text is supposed to do. So this was the old. These are the ancients, which in the Battle of the Book are represented by literal ancient writers. Then there is the modern idea of the text, of what a text can do in a modern concept. And this one is one that is derived from the developing empiricism in science. It is an idea that we should look for the most accurate qualities. So history is not just like Herodotus, there's these people over here who say this story and then this happened and we have no idea, but it's a good story, isn't it? To actually what we would more understand today in historical scholarship, in terms of that you research and you try to find it, create as accurate as possible. Of course, remembering you cannot, everything in history is interpretation. There is no objective truth. Everything is the evidence through interpretation, but science has that element to it too. So it's the limitations that you are given, but not wanting to misrepresent history. Victorians. I'm just saying. Victorians. This idea of creating an empirical idea of being able to represent the world as it actually is. So this is at the very early, this is happening at a very early stage in the 18th century. It's pre-Enlightenment 18th century, but it is a stepping stone to the notions that will become very prevalent throughout the 18th century and that we would very much associate with Enlightenment thinking. So this is a real genuine controversy that Swift is satirizing, and he's a young man. It is, some scholars have seen him as on the side of the ancients, but at the same time you can read him as not exactly on the side of the ancients, but more on the side of the moderns, and you can also read him as sort of sitting back and laughing at how stupid this is. All three readings really are possible with this text. So, what is it? What is the battle of the books? Well, while this theoretical argument is going on of what is literature for, what is the purpose of this, in the library, the books literally start mounting up and doing battle. The idea is that on Parnassus, the ancients have the high peak and the moderns have the lower peak, and the moderns are affronted at the ancients taking the high ground and being seen as superior to them. And so they demand that either the high peak be surrendered to them because it's about time, we had our turn in the sun because we're being cast in your shade, or that you level your mountains so that we are equal. So the ancients do not like this, and this squabble escalates, and they start to draw up their forces. There is a little diversion or a little digression with a spider and a bee that Aesop, the book of Aesop's Tales, literally goes and interprets for the battling books. That the spider is the moderns, who spins an intricate web but is not really adding much, and it's all made out of filth and their own self, whereas the ancients are like the bee, who go and bring beautiful things and are highly productive. It's a very Aesop is very very one-sided in that one, but the idea is this: it gives you a metaphorical concept or an allegorical concept of how these two arguments are framed. One is that you can't, that the flaw of the moderns is that although they can have this geometric precision and this empirical understanding, they're also basically spinning it out of themselves. It bears no relation to things in the world, whereas the bee, although it can get caught in this web, is engaging out in a real world. These books then earn the attention of the gods, the Olympian gods, who, much like in the Iliad, divide up onto the sides of the ancients and the moderns. So each side gets their gods. One of the gods is the goddess of criticism, who sides with the moderns. And the moderns also have her parents, which includes pride and I think ignorance, and her children and her sister, and they all come down to help the moderns in their battle, which are generally speaking not seen as nearly as powerful gods and goddesses as having Athena, goddess of wisdom, on your side. So, who is on the side of the ancients. So you have this dividing up, much as you do with Greece and Troy. The battle then commences, the battle being fought in very much the language, which is very deliberate. If you have read the Iliad, you will understand what he is satirizing. There is, you see Homer is like Hector, charging through the battlefield, or like, because it does look very much like that first battle that we see in the Iliad after the truce, after Menelaus and Paris fight, and the fighting then starts up. You see these big titles in ancient literature ploughing through the moderns having a go back, but on the whole, and then there are these gaps. There are about 7 breaks. So it's like an ancient text which is broken and incomplete because it is missing pieces, which is actually a bit you can read as a criticism of the ancients, that the ancient knowledge, for all of its high place on Parnassus, is incomplete. That there is a place for the moderns because it's filling in these gaps that have been lost to time. Homer is cutting swathes through the moderns. There is actually an imitation of one of the battles of the heroes in the Iliad, where 2 very matched soldiers, but also heroes. They're not just ordinary soldiers. Ordinary soldiers just get slaughtered. They're things like pamphlets on the side of the modern getting mowed down by ancients. But so even though the ancients are fewer than the moderns, they're more heavyweight, let's say. They have a bit more heft to them. There is a bit in the Iliad where two of the heroes come together, a Greek and a Trojan, and they fight, but it's more of they're actually related, and by the end of the fight it doesn't end with slaughter, it ends with them swapping armor with each other. And this is as Dryden and Virgil meeting up on the battlefield in the Battle of the Books, because so you have the Virgil in the original Latin, and then you have Dryden's translation of the Aeneid, and these 2 books act the same way. They swap armor, because Dryden's translation of Virgil is considered very, very highly, and in this imagining, Virgil approves of Dryden's translation. Dryden is a poet who is actually primarily known for his translations rather than his original works. He is not famous like most poets for his original stuff. A lot of his fame comes from his translation work, because translation, as we see with someone like Pope, is not an art. It's an art, not a science. It's a very different concept of translation, which I talked about in my Pope essay. So if you want, or Pope video, so if you want to go and have a look at that, you can. The battle ends because the manuscript is incomplete. It is actually inconclusive who wins, although at the point in which the manuscript ends, the ancients have the upper hand. but it is an incomplete manuscript. And so that's the Battle of the Books. It is really interesting, but we know how the battle ends, because it ends with the moderns winning. One of the things, because it's an academic argument. My defense for the moderns would be Aristotle's Meteorologica, the book that cul-de-saced European science into alchemy for centuries because of the reverence to Aristotle, not realizing he got every bloody thing wrong. And he cul-de-saced European science. So the moderns do have a point that some of the stuff that the ancients have is just BS. It is an incomplete understanding of the world. So the moderns have this position of attempting to have a better understanding of the world, to understand a concept of progress. Now, our concept of history has again changed. We are constantly living a battle of the books. Unfortunately, what has happened today, because I remember it has died down a little bit, but I remember the history wars, which occurred in the late 1990s, early 2000s in this country. The history wars, I think, are occurring in America at the moment, but we had a little outbreak of the history wars, which got quite nasty because they became political. Now, while Swift is talking satirically, it's funny, and the stakes are kind of low, because nobody is bringing in a whole load of politics into this. There is an element of, it doesn't really matter who wins this. And it is a shame that we can't bring that, a certain lightness back to things today, because now when we have things like the history wars, they become vicious, they become brutal. These are academic arguments. These are not life and death. No one goes to war, should be going to war over this. They are academic arguments that are dragged into a larger political argument, which is where the Battle of the Books would end up today. It would not be as light-hearted, because it would have a whole teams of people on the internet shouting at each other. And we think we're so sophisticated. But we do this today. Texts constantly change. And this is an example of a time when people are starting to realize, oh, there are different uses for a text, and not every text is going to fit that. Does that mean that a text suddenly loses its value? Well, in some cases, sometimes it does. And that's I think the concept of the Battle of the Books, is something like Homer is not going to lose its value as a narrative. It may lose its value in terms of this is how you should behave, but in terms of a narrative, this thing is thousands of years old. It is a really exciting narrative. We are translating it again and again and again. We are reinterpreting it. We are playing with it. It's always going to be this big heavyweight thing pushing its way through. It is mineable by other writers, and therefore it has that place. A lot of the ancient texts have that quality. We still use in common day parlance a concept like Oedipus, probably not in the way that the ancient Greeks would have understood it, because we have translated that into a more modern world, but we use it. You don't need to really explain anything when you say something like Oedipus or Medea. These things still have resonance, but they're not used in the same way. So the Battle of the Books, some of these things, it was understanding the way that we're using text is changing, and it has resistance to it, But it is changing, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a bad thing that the way that we use its text changes. When we have people fighting over this, it is kind of silly, because there is an element of, we have the high ground, so we want to keep holding it. Well, that's all well and good, but is it worth it? Really? You know, and often it is a case, like in the Battle of the Books, where a small number of people or a small number of figures are holding that high ground and don't want to admit new voices, because that is what the battle always is. The battle is almost always new people wanting to engage and wanting to come into the argument, wanting to have their voices heard. And that is what the moderns are saying to the ancients, is we would like our time to be heard, because you have the high place, and it's maybe now time that we get a turn there so that we are heard, because we are not being heard under in your shadow. So it is a very interesting little text. It really does give an idea of how people were looking at books, how there were different camps of people understanding text, and the fact that text is never static. Never, ever, ever is it static. And that sometimes prioritizing one over another does not necessarily mean that the other is unvalued. It's just that we need to raise some other voices instead. So it's only a very small little thing. It's only about 20 pages. It is quite fun when you get to the actual battle itself. Probably a good idea if you're familiar with the Iliad. So even there, he's being intertextual. He wouldn't necessarily understand that. He's creating a piece of satire. But you need here is a modern piece of writing, a pamphlet, a literal pamphlet, which is on the modernist side, that you need to have an understanding of the ancients to understand. So I think ultimately the reason the battle is inconclusive is because neither side can be superior to the other. They're both necessary, even if one is no longer the way that we see the world. That okay, yeah, probably best to accept that science was dodgy. Really dodgy. That cul-de-sac for centuries. That was not a good thing. It was not a good. Every time I hear stuff about alchemy, I just think about the centuries of wasted time and intellect that was spent in the Middle Ages in this intellectual cul-de-sac. It took ages to get out of that thing before things could actually progress. So there are some cul-de-sacs if you only stay with the ancients and don't progress. Anyway, that is the Battle of the Books. Nice and quick this week. We're going to have a look at, I think it's 3 German fairy tales. They're romantic period fairy tales for adults. So we're just having a bit of a break from our short pieces. We'll be back with our Augustan writers after this, but next time we will have a look at some German romantic fairy tales, just for a change. So until then, farewell. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.